Our final stop on our long and winding journey through the vast and intricate tapestry of the medieval world brings us to the shores of the Bosporus, to an empire which had endured, adapted, and defiantly persisted since the twilight of antiquity. The Eastern Roman Empire, a direct and unbroken continuation of the ancient Roman state, began its unique historical trajectory as the eastern division of that vast world-spanning polity. When the eternal city of Rome itself fell into a state of irreversible decline and was ultimately sacked and supplanted in the mid-400s, the Eastern Empire, centered on the magnificent and strategically unparalleled city of Constantinople, did not merely survive, it continued on, vibrant and resilient, for another 4,000 years. Its history was not one of simple, linear decline, but was punctuated by numerous periods of astonishing prosperity, military resurgence, and profound cultural flourishing. The inhabitants of this empire, though their culture, language, and customs had gradually Hellenized over the centuries, never ceased to consider themselves Ronawoi, Romans. In their minds, they were not the successors to Rome, they were Rome. The empire was the direct, divinely sanctioned heir to the legacy of Augustus and Constantine. They looked upon their capital, Constantinople, the new Rome, with a sense of awe and pride, believing it to be the undisputed capital of the civilized world and the holiest city of all Christian kingdoms. A beacon of orthodoxy and imperial splendor. Its grandeur, its immense wealth, and its formidable defenses were seen not just as political tools, but as manifestations of God's favor upon his chosen people and their emperor. During the early 500s, this empire, which had often been on the defensive, would reach new, breathtaking heights under the dynamic and ambitious Justinian dynasty. The dynasty was formally founded in 518 by Justin I, a former swineherd from Illyria, who rose through the ranks of the military to seize the throne. But it was his nephew and chosen successor, Justinian, a man of immense energy, vision, and administrative genius, who would truly define the era and stamp his name indelibly upon history. His dream was nothing less than a Renovatio Imperia Romanorum, a grand, sweeping project to restore the Roman Empire to its former geographical extent and glory, to reunite the Latin West with the Greek East under one sovereign, one law, and one faith. To achieve this audacious goal, Justinian relied on one of the most brilliant military minds of all time, his general, Flavius Belisarius. Still a young man, Belisarius possessed a rare combination of tactical ingenuity, personal bravery, and unwavering loyalty to his emperor. It was he who would be the sharp point of Justinian's ambition. An invasion was launched westward, targeting the Germanic kingdoms that had risen from the ashes of the Western Empire. The first targets were the Vandals. After their infamous sacking of Rome in 455, this Germanic tribe had continued their migrations across the Mediterranean and settled in the rich provinces of North Africa, forming a powerful and piratical kingdom. Though they significantly outnumbered the expeditionary force Belisarius brought with him, years of comfortable living had made them complacent. Their king, Gelimer, failed to take advantage of a decisive opportunity to crush the Roman landing, a fatal hesitation which instead allowed the methodical Belisarius to choose the time and place of attack. At the Battle of Ad Decinum and later at Tricomarum, the Vandal forces were utterly routed. By 534, the Vandal kingdom had ceased to exist, its territories once again flying the Roman standard. The first, crucial phase of Justinian's grand project was complete. After being recalled home to a triumphal reception, Belisarius was scarcely given time to rest before being dispatched again, this time to Sicily and the Italian peninsula, in 535. The land that had been the very heart of the ancient empire was now occupied by the Ostrogothic kingdom, which we detailed in our previous episode. This invasion marked the start of the Gothic War, a conflict of staggering brutality that would drag on for almost 2 devastating decades, draining the empire's treasury and manpower. Initially, the Ostrogoths were in the midst of internal political rifts following the death of their great king, Theodoric. Consequently, Belisarius faced little resistance on his swift march up the peninsula. He was even invited into Rome by the Pope, who saw in the Roman emperor a preferable master to the Arian Goth. However, when the Ostrogothic king, Witiges, heard of this, he mobilized his forces and sent perhaps one of the largest armies ever assembled on the peninsula to besiege Rome and reclaim it. The siege lasted for over a year, a grueling test of endurance for defender and attacker alike. But the walls of Rome, though ancient, were still strong, and Belisarius, a master of defense, had fortified them too well. He conducted a brilliant sorties, and effectively managing his limited resources. Witiges's failure to break the siege reflected his own broader failures as a military leader and king. The siege was eventually broken, and Belisarius, though often undermanned and undersupplied from a wary Justinian, continued his campaign, capturing the Ostrogothic capital of Ravenna in 540 through a clever ruse and deposing Witiges. But the Ostrogoths proved far more resilient than expected. Under a new, charismatic, and fiercely determined king named Totila, they forced a stunning counterattack. Totila understood that he could not defeat the Romans in open battle against a commander like Belisarius. Instead, he waged a war of movement, winning over the oppressed Italian peasantry by promising reform and systematically reconquering city after city. By 552, he had managed to reverse almost all of Belisarius's gains, reconquering most of the Italian peninsula. The situation was desperate. An aging and frustrated Belisarius had been recalled, his reputation somewhat tarnished by this protracted and bloody stalemate. Justinian then sent in his other great general, a eunuch of Armenian origin named Narses. Though advanced in age, Narses was a political and strategic genius. He advanced into Italy from the north with a massive, well-supplied coalition of troops, including Lombard allies. He met Totila's army at the Battle of Taganai. There, Narses employed a masterful defensive formation, centering his line on dismounted foederati and flanking them with thousands of expert archers. The Ostrogothic cavalry charge was funneled into this killing zone and annihilated. Totila was mortally wounded during the fight, and with his death, the heart went out of the Ostrogothic resistance. By 554, the Ostrogothic kingdom was no more, and the grueling Gothic War had finally ended. Fittingly, Rome was back in the empire. Before long, Byzantine forces also conquered a stretch of southern Spain from the Visigoths, and for a brief, glorious moment, the empire began to look as it had under the ancient Romans, a true, dominant Mediterranean power once again. Justinian's legacy, however, extends far beyond mere military conquest. He is credited with a profound and enduring influence on Western culture through his monumental codification of Roman law. The Eastern Empire, having avoided the worst of the barbarian invasions, had maintained access to vast archives of legal and political documents from earlier centuries. Justinian, a deeply legal-minded administrator, became very familiar with this chaotic and often contradictory mass of statutes, edicts, and juristic opinions. He hired a brilliant jurist, Tribonian, to lead a commission with the task of collecting, editing, and compiling these into a single, coherent, and authoritative set of edicts. This colossal undertaking was called the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. The Corpus Juris Civilis consists of 4 main parts, each serving a distinct purpose. The Codex Justinianus, or Code of Justinian, was the first part published in 529. It contained all of the still valid imperial enactments and laws from the time of the ancient Emperor Hadrian, right up to Justinian's own reign, purged of repetition and contradiction. The Digesta, or Pandex, was completed in 533 and was perhaps the most ambitious part. It was a massive compilation of excerpts from the writings of great Roman jurists like Ulpian and Gaius, distilling centuries of legal wisdom and precedent into a usable format. The Institutiones, or Institutes, were also published in 533 as an introductory textbook on Roman law for students, providing a systematic overview of legal principles. Finally, the Novelae Constitutionis, or novels, were a collection of new laws enacted by Justinian himself after the publication of the first 3 parts. These were later added to the collection after his death to complete the compilation. The corpus played a truly significant role in preserving and transmitting Roman legal principles and concepts through the ages. It became the foundational text for nearly all civil law systems in continental Europe and beyond. It is a testament to its importance that it was the last official work from the Eastern Empire, produced primarily in Latin, as Greek soon became the favored language of court and government once again, marking a final cultural break with the Old Latin West. Though his reign is rightly considered one of the Eastern Empire's golden ages, this isn't to say Justinian didn't face immense hardships and terrifying challenges. His first great trial was of a personal nature. Before he was emperor, he became utterly smitten by a captivating and intelligent young lady named Theodora. She was the daughter of a bear-keeper for the factions at the Hippodrome in Constantinople. When her father died, Theodora and her sisters were left in poverty. Following in her mother's footsteps, Theodora became an actress and a dancer, professions that in that time were deeply associated with prostitution and placed one on the lowest rungs of society. Her early life was marked by scandal and hardship. It wasn't until his uncle, Emperor Justin, changed the ancient laws forbidding members of the senatorial class from marrying actresses that Justinian was able to marry Theodora, elevating her to patrician status. When Justinian became emperor in 527, Theodora was crowned Augusta, his empress and co-ruler in nearly every sense. She proved to be a formidable political partner, possessing a steel will, sharp political instincts, and a courage that often surpassed her husband's. She used her influence to advocate for the rights of women, helping to establish churches and monasteries, including a convent for former prostitutes to give them a refuge and a new life. She was a fervent supporter of the Monophysite Christian faction, often acting as a patron and protector for them within the predominantly Chalcedonian court, and she involved herself deeply in diplomacy and political appointments. Soon after their coronation, in 532, Justinian and Theodora faced their greatest political crisis, the Nika riots. Nika, meaning conquer or win, was the cry that could be heard roaring from the Hippodrome during the exhilarating chariot races as rival factions urged their teams to victory. This titanic amphitheatre, the center of Constantinople's social life, was capable of holding more than 60,000 spectators. The 2 main charioteer factions were the Blues and the Greens. But these were far more than modern sports fan clubs. They were powerful socio-political organizations with their own militia, wealthy patrons, and significant influence over urban politics. Rivalries between them could often spill out of the Hippodrome and into the streets, becoming violent and even overtly political. The crisis began when a member of the Blues and a member of the Greens were arrested for murder following a riot and were sentenced to execution. Both men escaped and fled to a church, claiming sanctuary. At the next chariot games, with Justinian in attendance, the supporters of the 2 fugitives, in a rare moment of unity, banded together, directing their angry and vitriolic chants not at each other, but at the emperor, demanding mercy for the 2 men. The crowd soon grew overwhelming, and the games were cancelled. Mobs of people vomited out of the Hippodrome and went on a mad 5-day campaign of destruction and insurrection. Large parts of the city were set ablaze, the royal palace was besieged, the praetorium and the baths of Xaexippus were burned, and the great church of the HagiaSophia, the city's most prominent church, was consumed by flames. The mobs even chose for themselves a new emperor, Hypatius, a nephew of a former emperor. The situation seemed hopeless. Panicked advisors urged Justinian to flee the capital. At a tense council of war, as the palace shook from the sounds of the riot, it was Theodora who spoke with unshakable resolve. She declared that royalty is a fine burial shroud, and convinced her husband that it was better to stay and fight, to meet death as emperors, than to live as fugitives. Her courage steeled Justinian's nerve. One of his loyal generals, the eunuch Narses, was sent out with a bag of gold to bribe the blue faction leaders, reminding them that Hypatius was a green, and stoking the old divisions between them. Meanwhile, the generals Belisarius and Mundus gathered what loyal troops remained. Belisarius led his veteran guardsmen into the Hippodrome, where the rioters had gathered to crown Hypatius. What followed was not a battle but a slaughter. Trapped in the confined space, tens of thousands of rebels were cut down. By the end of the day, the revolt was crushed, and Hypatius was executed. The city was left in smoldering ruins. But from this ashes, Justinian rebuilt it bigger, better, and more magnificent than ever. It remained the largest and most splendid city in Europe. He built new roads, bridges, public baths, schools, monasteries, hospitals, and especially churches. In the capital alone, he built a stunning 34 of these. The most famous of these projects was the rebuilding of the church that had burned during the Nika revolts, the Church of the Holy Wisdom, the HagiaSophia. Justinian commissioned 2 Greek scientists-mathematicians from Anatolia, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, to design it. They abandoned traditional basilica forms and conceived a structure of breathtaking audacity, centered on a massive, seemingly floating dome. Justinian poured immense resources into the project, requisitioning materials from across the empire. Just 5 years later, in 537, the project was complete. This new HagiaSophia was utterly unprecedented in scale and design. Its vast dome, pierced by 40 windows, appeared to be suspended from heaven by a golden chain. The interior was lavished with acres of gold mosaic, polished marble columns, and precious stones. Upon entering it for the first time, Justinian is said to have murmured, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." It would remain the largest piece of Christian architecture for almost 1,000 years, a defining symbol of Byzantine imperial power and religious devotion. Along with the sprawling royal palace and the massive hippodrome, the HagiaSophia became one of the most magnificent and iconic buildings in the world. But Justinian's next hardship was one no amount of walls or courage could stop. In 542, the empire was struck down by a horrific plague. The same bacterium, Yersinia pestis, responsible for the devastating Black Death which would hit Eurasia in the late Middle Ages, arrived via trade routes from Egypt. Justinian himself contracted the disease and fell gravely ill. Though he survived his personal fight with the sickness, this pandemic, later called the Plague of Justinian, was catastrophic. It killed around 1 in 5 people in Constantinople, and contemporary sources describe streets filled with corpses and a city gripped by terror. The disease spread throughout the Mediterranean basin and the Arabian Peninsula, recurring in waves for the next 2 centuries. The demographic and economic effects were devastating. The tax base shrank dramatically, agricultural production collapsed, and the army struggled to find recruits. The plague, combined with the enormous cost of his western expansion campaigns, left the empire financially exhausted, vulnerable, and strategically overextended. The final years of his reign were shadowed by these losses. Theodora, his partner and empress, died of cancer in 548, leaving Justinian to rule alone for almost another 2 decades. a period often seen as less dynamic than the first half of his reign. His great general, Belisarius, died in 565, and Justinian himself followed just 8 months later. It was truly the end of an era. The declining state of the empire, drained by plague and war, couldn't be saved by Justinian's ineffectual successors. Soon after his death, the Lombards, another Germanic group, entered Italy, setting up their own kingdom under their king, Alboin. The Eastern Romans weren't completely expelled, but were forced to retreat to coastal strongholds, retaining a territory called the Exarchate of Ravenna, which would bring them into constant conflict with the new arrivals for centuries. In Spain, the Visigoths recovered their lost territories by the early 600s. Justinian's grand vision of a renewed Roman Empire, so nearly realized, seemingly died with him. It was a major turning point, and soon it was the Eastern Romans themselves who would face a relentless onslaught of external threats: a resurgent Sassanid Persia in the east, the Avars along the Danube, and relentless Slavic invasions into the Balkans. The Justinian dynasty continued under 3 more emperors, but it was a shadow of its former self. The last emperor, Maurice, was a capable ruler but was hated by the army for his strictness and cost-cutting measures. In 602, a successful army revolt erupted on the Danube front. The leader was a centurion named Phocas, who marched on Constantinople. Maurice was overthrown and murdered, along with his sons, an act that shattered the legitimacy of the state. Phocas, the officer, was then proclaimed emperor. He ruled with little success, his reign marked by paranoia, brutality, and further military disasters. He was widely deemed a usurper, and his rule destabilized the empire even further, opening the door for the Sassanid Persians to launch a devastating invasion. In 610 he was overthrown and executed by Heraclius, the son of the Exarch of Africa, who sailed to Constantinople with a fleet. This established the Heraclian dynasty, which would rule the empire for over 100 years and fundamentally transform it to meet the existential crises it now faced. During the reign of Heraclius, the empire was under constant, existential threat. The Sassanid Persians overran the eastern provinces, capturing Jerusalem and even Egypt, the empire's breadbasket. At the same time, Slavic tribes flooded into the Balkans, reaching the walls of Constantinople itself. The empire was on the brink of collapse. Heraclius responded with a series of desperate but brilliant reforms. By the mid-600s, he had to implement a new system of defense and administration called the theme system, themata. This replaced the older provincial system set up by Diocletian and Constantine. The themes were military districts where land was granted to soldier farmers in return for hereditary military service. This combined civilian and military authority in the hands of a general, strategos, creating a more efficient, localized defense structure that could respond quickly to invasions. It was a system that had echoes of much earlier practices, harkening back to the military colonies of the ancient Romans. The ancient Romans and Parthians had engaged in constant warfare since the days of the Republic. This long-standing rivalry continued under the Roman Empire, with the Parthians' successors, the Sassanids, who grew to be the most powerful of the Iranian empires. Though the Western Roman Empire went into decline, the Eastern Romans and Sassanids continued their stalemate for another 2 centuries, the 2 most powerful military entities in Eurasia. Heraclius, initially on the back foot, eventually took the field himself in a daring counteroffensive. He bypassed the main Persian armies, campaigned deep in their territory, and secured a decisive victory at the Battle of Nineveh in 1627. This ultimately forced the Persians to sue for peace and return all conquered territories. But this epic war, a true world war of its day, just exhausted both empires' resources to the breaking point. This mutual exhaustion paved the way for a new, unexpected, and utterly formidable contender, one which would come to threaten the Eastern Empire even more than the Sassanids ever had. This new power came from a coalition of newly unified tribes from the Arabian Peninsula. For more information on the Arab expansion, you can check out our previous episode. Under the Rashidun and later the Umayyad caliphs, the Arabs launched a swift, religiously fueled invasion into the Near East. The war-weary Byzantine and Persian armies were no match for their mobility and zeal. The Eastern Romans were defeated decisively in 636 at the Battle of Yarmouk, near the Yarmouk River. Though the Romans lost their grain-producing territories in Egypt and their rich tax revenues from the Levant, they were more fortunate than the Sassanid Empire, which collapsed entirely under the Arab onslaught. The Arabs, now controlling a vast empire, turned their attention to the greatest prize of all, Constantinople itself. The capital of the empire was one of the most well-defended cities of the ancient and medieval world, its impenetrable Theodosian walls having kept it safe from siege since their founding centuries earlier. Knowing of the city's fabled fortifications, the Arabs, under Caliph Muawiyah, set up a naval blockade and attacked seasonally from 674 to 678. Though their armies came prepared for a long campaign, they could not prepare for one of the empire's most fearsome secret weapons. As the Arab ships approached the seawalls, their wooden hulls would suddenly burst into flames. The Byzantine defenders rained down liquid hellfire upon their foes, using pressurized siphons to shoot this terrifying substance like ancient flamethrowers, and even creating incendiary grenades. This was the legendary Greek fire, a sticky naphtha-based compound most likely containing crude oil, sulfur, and quicklime, which ignited on contact with water. Its exact recipe remained a closely guarded state secret, known only to the emperor and a few artisans, but it did its job magnificently in breaking the siege. The Arab fleet was devastated. Especially of again, the combination of the massive land walls, the brutal winter, Bulgarian attacks on the Arab rear, and the critical use of Greek fire by the Emperor Leo III resulted in a catastrophic defeat for the invaders. This victory secured Asia Minor for the empire for centuries and forced more permanent borders to be drawn just south of Anatolia. It was a tough century for the empire, as they had lost their holdings in the Near East as well as North Africa. To the north, the Heracleans faced another major invasion, this from a group of Turkic semi-nomadic warriors called the Bulgars. We mentioned them in our double-length overview of the Middle Ages, so be sure to check that out. The Bulgars had arrived in the Balkans by the late 7th century. In 680, the Bulgars under Khan Asparukh, allied with South Slavic tribes, defeated the Byzantine armies of Constantine IV, setting up the First Bulgarian Empire in the Balkans. This created a permanent and powerful rival to the north, resulting in further territorial losses for the Eastern Roman Empire. By the early 700s, the days of Roman glory seemed well and truly over. The empire was a fraction of its former size, consisting of little more than Asia Minor, the coast of the Balkans, and some fragments of Italy. Though the empire was much smaller by the end of the Heraclean dynasty than at its start, the theme system helped them retain their core territories in Greece and Anatolia. The Eastern Roman Empire had gone from a contender to restore the old Roman Empire to a state barely holding on to its own survival, fighting for its life on all fronts. Some historians refer to this next period as the Byzantines' Dark Ages. After a transition that took centuries, the empire was left with a different, more unique, and more homogenized culture, which later historians have called Byzantine. The Empires. Latin, the language of the old Romans, declined almost completely from everyday and administrative use, and Greek became both the common and official language of the Byzantine Empire. Its culture was a synthesis of Roman statecraft, Greek language and learning, and Eastern Orthodox Christianity. As the one. And statues to adorn their sacred spaces. This mix of extreme piety and extreme reverence for their religious art actually became a point of contention, so stark that it caused widespread political instability for over a century. Religious images, or icons, of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints had become commonplace in churches and homes, used as aids to veneration. But a growing movement, influenced by Islamic and Jewish anachronism, the rejection of religious images, and by a strict interpretation of the Old Testament prohibition against graven images, began to view this widespread use of icons as a form of idolatry, the worship of idols, an act strictly forbidden in Scripture. Those who defended the religious images, the iconodules, claimed they were not worshipped but venerated, and that they served as a means of spiritual connection and visual understanding for the illiterate, who could read the gospel through images. By 695, the issue became political when a representation of Christ was placed on the backs of newly minted coins, making the state itself a promoter of icons. After the Heracleans were deposed, a period of anarchy ensued before the Isaurian dynasty took power in 717, under Leo III, the emperor who had saved Constantinople from the Second Arab Siege. During his reign, he attempted to purify the Christian faith from what he believed was a dangerous slide into idolatry, especially among powerful Christian monks. In what has become known as the First Byzantine Iconoclasm, image breaking, Leo outlawed the use of icons in 726. This act caused deep internal divisions with long-lasting consequences. There was widespread destruction of religious images, mosaics were whitewashed, and statues were melted down. Those who were viewed as venerating icons, particularly monks and the urban elite of Constantinople, were persecuted, while the poor and those living in Anatolia, closer to the Arab border and more sympathetic to iconoclastic ideas, weren't primarily affected. The wealthier citizens of the capital and those living in the Byzantine provinces in southern Italy strongly opposed it. The popes in Rome also strongly condemned the move, creating a significant rift between the East and West that would culminate in the Great Schism of the 11th century. Though the edict was reversed 70 years later in 787 by the Seventh Ecumenical Council, Second Council of Nicaea, which affirmed the proper use of icons, the iconoclasm controversy fueled future political divisions and instability within the empire for generations. Under the Isaurian and subsequent Amorian dynasties, the Byzantines continued to lose territory. They lost the Exarchate of Ravenna in Italy to the Lombards, who were in turn conquered by the Franks. The Frankish king, Papin the Short, then gave the land to the papacy, forming the nucleus of the Papal States. The Byzantines reorganized the provinces that remained in the south of the Italian peninsula and on Sicily, but these would be fought over for centuries by Lombards, Arabs, and later the Normans. From the 500s to the 700s, during the reigns of the Justinian to the Isaurian emperors, the Byzantines never wavered in their self-perception as the legitimate inheritors of the Christian Roman tradition. Emperors were deemed divinely chosen to rule, gods vicegerent on earth, and subjects were to show them utmost reverence. The imperial court was a theater of power, governed by intricate ritual designed to emphasize the emperor's semi-divine status. The was daily was. Special ceremonies were also added for promotions, birthdays, marriages, and religious festivals. Unlike the fragmented kingdoms in the West, the Byzantine Empire stayed relatively centralized, with the power of the emperor theoretically absolute. The nobles and aristocrats were typically part of the vast bureaucracy, the clergy or the military, all closely linked to and dependent on the emperor. The emperor and his government maintained a strong grip on the economy by regulating agricultural and manufacturing industries and controlling commerce, often with a monopoly on critical trades like grain and silk. This hands-on approach, a form of state capitalism, began during the ancient period as foreign threats brought more need for centralization and revenue. This also meant the Byzantines were quite familiar with war and maintained a sophisticated military apparatus. Though a defensive culture first and foremost, they kept their armies armed with the latest weaponry and their officers trained with the latest military literature, emphasizing the art of diplomacy, espionage, and strategic cunning as much as brute force. Some of their methods became proverbial for their complexity and deviousness, giving us the modern term Byzantine to describe intricate and opaque political scheming. But though their stealthy and often duplicitous methods led to victories outside the empire, these same palace politics, characterized by plots, coups, and assassinations, constantly threatened it from within. Despite Western Europe inheriting much of the old Roman Empire's institutional framework, it was the Byzantines who truly held the essence of the continuous imperial state. Not only did they act as a crucial buffer state, absorbing the onslaught of encroaching Islamic armies for centuries, allowing the West to develop in relative security, but they also acted as the primary guardians of classical knowledge. Justinian's codification of Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, was preserved and studied in Constantinople long after it was forgotten in the West. It eventually found its way to Italy in the High Middle Ages and became widely studied, forming the basis for numerous European legal systems. As the empire included the Greek heartlands, countless ancient Greek classical works, the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle, the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides, and ain't scientific texts of most Byzantine literature was focused on practical, legal, or military affairs, but as the Byzantines were devoutly religious, they also produced a vast corpus of religious essays, sermons, and biographies of saints. Procopius of Caesarea was the court historian during the reign of Justinian in the 500s and accompanied Belisarius during his campaigns abroad. His History of the Wars is our main source for the Byzantine wars with the Persians in the east and the reconquest of the Mediterranean in the west, both the Vandalic War and the Gothic War. He modeled his works after the great ancient Greek historian Thucydides, our main source for the Peloponnesian War. Both works even mention calamitous plagues which devastated their cities, Procopius dealing with the Justinian plague and Thucydides with the plague of Athens 1,000 years prior. Apart from fostering an intellectual and legal culture and acting as a military buffer, the Byzantines served as the primary gateway to the east for Western Europe. They were the center of trade between the two continents. Though Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa later became major trading hubs, for centuries, luxury products from the east first passed through the markets of Constantinople before being shipped across the Mediterranean. Traders came to the capital from Egypt, the Caucasus, the Ruslands, Persia, Italy, and beyond, making it a fabulously wealthy and cosmopolitan trading hub. Europeans continued their obsession with Eastern silks, spices, perfumes, and jewelry, all funneled through the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines also had a significant market that dealt in the buying and selling of humans. These prisoners of war, often from Slavic communities to the north, were a major export, giving us the word slave, derived from Slav. In another economic coup, the empire broke China's monopoly on silk production. According to legend, 2 Christian Nestorian monks, with the aid of Emperor Justinian, smuggled silkworm eggs from China, hidden inside hollow bamboo canes, and brought them to the West. This ended China's dominance, and the Byzantine Empire began its own sericulture, producing silk in state-controlled workshops in the royal palace itself. This industry made the empire fabulously wealthy, and became a key tool of diplomacy, as gifts of silk were used to impress and influence foreign rulers. After the turmoil of the second period of iconoclasm in the early 800s, the Byzantines endured under the Amorian dynasty during a time of general decline. Most distressing for their imperial prestige was the coronation of the Frankish king, expressing the Romans of the bodies with the most careful bodies of the country. This act was a direct challenge to the Byzantine emperor's unique claim to be the sole legitimate Roman emperor. It didn't sit well with the Byzantines, who viewed themselves as the true inheritors of the Roman tradition and still viewed the Germanic societies in the West as uncultured barbarians. A tense diplomacy ensued, eventually leading to a compromise where the Byzantines recognized Charlemagne's imperial title, but not his Roman emperor. Iconoclasm returned in 813 under Emperor Leo V, bringing with it further division with the West and internal strife. However, soon after, another schism polarized the East and West, though it was eventually healed. This was the Photian Schism, occurring during the mid-800s. It revolved around the controversial appointment of the learned layman Photios as the Patriarch of Constantinople, bypassing the regular ecclesiastical hierarchy. The schism involved complex religious disputes, jurisdictional conflicts between Rome and Constantinople, and political power struggles. It was eventually resolved in 879, but it was a precursor to the final schism. Contemporary historians viewed Emperor Michael III, Theodora's son, as the last in a long line of incompetent leaders of this period. He was even known derisively as Michael the Drunkard. Despite this, his reign ironically brought in a new era of intellectualism and contributed to a period of high culture during the next dynasty. Keeping in line with his uninformed and pleasure-seeking nature, Michael befriended a poor Macedonian peasant named Basil, who came to impress the emperor with his brute strength and wrestling abilities. Now in the inner circle, Basil ingratiated himself, married the emperor's mistress, and began sowing division within the court, murdering Bardas, Michael's uncle and the de facto ruler. Soon after, in 867, Basil had Michael killed as well. Both his hands were chopped off before he was stabbed through the heart. Basil then took the throne, founding the Macedonian dynasty. After the slow decline that followed the Justinians, a period sometimes called the Byzantine Dark Ages, it was time for another golden era. It was time for Renaissance. Once the Macedonian dynasty took power, they stabilized their borders against invaders and mended diplomatic affairs with the Western Church. Coming from humble beginnings, these emperors were often more populist, strengthening the standing of free farmers who were losing land to wealthy aristocrats. And they oversaw a golden age for both culture and imperial power, called the Macedonian Renaissance. It was mostly exemplified through emperors like Leo VI the Wise and Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos, born in the purple, who left a mark on Byzantine history through their administrative reforms, literary contributions, and attempts to strengthen the empire internally and externally. The Macedonian Renaissance witnessed a dramatic revival of interest in classical Greek literature, philosophy, and science. Byzantine scholars and intellectuals focused on studying and preserving ancient Greek texts, leading to a rediscovery of ancient knowledge well before the Italian Renaissance and renewed appreciation for classical works. The Macedonian emperors, particularly Basil I and his successors, supported and patronized the arts, sciences, and education. They established centers of learning such as the renowned University of Constantinople, or Patriarchal Academy, where scholars gathered to study and exchange ideas. Emperors and the wealthy elites sponsored the creation of magnificent illuminated manuscripts, the construction of new churches and palaces, and the commissioning of artwork, emoting a vibrant cultural scene. The period saw remarkable achievements in Byzantine art and architecture. Artists and architects developed innovative techniques, revitalizing classical motifs and incorporating new elements. Religious iconography flourished after the end of iconoclasm, and the Byzantine Church commissioned elaborate mosaics, frescoes, and icons for churches and monasteries. The imperial court reached new heights of splendor. Foreign dignitaries would be utterly stunned by the empire's throne room, the Chrysotrachlinos, which featured automated marvels, golden birds that sang from golden trees, and golden lions which thumped their tails and roared. The throne itself, through a hidden mechanism, could rest on the ground 1 minute and rise into the air the next, awing visitors. It was also during this dynasty that the Byzantine Church successfully Christianized the Eastern Slavs, most notably the Kievan Rus, one of its most long-lasting cultural and religious accomplishments. During the 900s, the empire was flourishing once again. After its more cultured and scholarly phase, it was time for a period of offensive military expansion. These campaigns began early in the century and culminated with the most successful military emperor since Justinian, Basil II. He dedicated his long reign almost entirely to war. His greatest achievement was the total conquest of the First Bulgarian Empire, a rival that had plagued the empire for centuries. He annexed their land. Make sure to subscribe to our channel for more history documentaries, and tell us in the comments which part of this documentary was most interesting to you. Thank you for watching and being a part of our journey through history, and we'll see you in the next documentary.